Well, hey, good morning, Sugar Hill Church. If I've not gotten the privilege to meet you, my name is Jordan. I get to be the student pastor here, and if it's your first time, I just want to give you a really, really warm welcome. We're so glad that you decided to spend your Sunday here with us, and on Labor Day weekend, nonetheless. We had 4 baptisms this morning, which was awesome to be during Labor Day weekend. So for you noble few, many that are here this morning, and for those that are watching online, we're glad that you are here on Labor Day weekend and on college football kickoff weekend, right? Like, I don't know why I said that so confidently. I had to Google it yesterday. I don't watch college football. I don't know a whole lot about college football, but I do know, I think somewhere in my contract, I'm obligated to tell you that UGA won yesterday or something. Right, Chuck? So go Dogs, I guess, right? But I just want you to know that we're so glad that you're here and you spent your Sunday with us. When I think about college football, I think about the most important position on the football field. We're going to say it on 3. You ready? 1, 2, 3. The backup quarterback. The backup quarterback. Most important position on the entire football field. I've heard a quote that says this. It says, it's like being the real QB, but without all the pain. You get to experience all the massages and the nice dinners and all the glory and go to all the parties, all the things, but you don't actually get hit because you can't hit the backup quarterback because if he gets hurt, we're all in trouble, right? And it's funny, there are people that have made a career out of sitting on the sideline with a clipboard and a headphone making millions of dollars. In fact, I read online this week that there are several, like a few different quarterbacks within the last 20 years that have played less than 10 games but have made over $20 million in their career. And I'm like, man, what'd I do to be a backup quarterback? You know what I mean? And the real problem that comes is that they're really the most popular guy in town, because what happens in football is when the QB1 throws like 3 interceptions that day, the camera aggressively pans over to the backup QB and he's standing there like, I'm ready to go, right? Like he's got the war paint on and everyone's questioning, and they ask the coach after the game, they're like, why didn't you put him in? Like, he could have saved us. We would have won if whatever. And the coach really wants to say, if only you knew, brother. I see him every week during practice. He is not that guy. You know what I mean? And it's really funny. So the backup QB, but the real problem comes is when QB1 gets hurt, and then QB2 gets hurt, and they start to look down the line, and they're like, have any of you ever been a quarterback before? And the lineman who played quarterback in 5th grade raises his hand, and everyone's like, yeah, you're not that guy, pal. You're not that guy. And they start to look down the line. The wide receiver's like, I played in my 1A school as a quarterback. And you're like, okay. And they start to look and they start to wonder, like, can the punter throw the football? Like, he's kind of athletic. And can he figure it out? He can, catch the snap. You know what I'm saying? And long story short, I'm the punter. So I'm here this morning, and it's great to be here with you. Hello. My name is Jordan. But no, jokes aside, it's awesome to be with you here this morning. I know nothing about college football, so don't ask me. But last week, we wrapped up this series. Pastor Bobby was here, and he wrapped up this series called Get After It. And he focused on finding community and how ultimately that can make us better at life. He went through 4 different reasons why, some of them very spiritual, but some of them very practical ways and reasons that community can make our life better. The first he talked about was that community is the foundation of following Jesus. If we want to put our life and look like Jesus, then we've got to do what Jesus does, and he surrounded himself with community with his disciples. The second reason is that community is a framework for a fulfilling life. If we want to have a full and free and abundant life, then we have to surround ourselves in community. But there's the practical side of it too, where community, regardless of spiritual, it's a furnace for our foundation, or our formation, rather. It's a furnace for our formation. It helps guide us. It helps lead us. It helps people around us, help shape us into being the person that we want to become. Like, community is so important to our development. And then the last one was that community is a fuel for our commitment. It's community is a fuel for our commitment. It helps us keep us consistent and helps us keep us committed. And so what happens is there's this spectrum where when you get involved in a community, regardless of where it is, regardless of what group it is, when you get involved in a community, it starts with consistency. And consistency builds trust, and trust builds authenticity. But what happens is we get stuck somewhere along this spectrum of our relationships and our friendships where we struggle to really find trust because we don't know if we really trust this person or not. And we're sure as heck not going to tell them anything about ourselves and be authentic, because if they knew what was going on in our life, then well, if I can't really trust them, then why would I ever share with them? And what happens is we get stuck along this spectrum of community. And so this morning, what I want to talk about is the truth is life is hard. Life is not all rainbow and sunshine, however the Rocky quote goes. Shows my age there. But there are so many things in our life that go on that many of those around us never even know it. And I hear from so many of our students the stuff that they're walking through, the things that are in their closet, the stresses that they have, the stuff that they don't want anybody to see, and they feel like they can't tell anyone in the world about it. They feel like they can't share it. They feel like they have no one to talk to about it. By now, you maybe have seen on the news or read the article or heard through word of mouth, but last week there was a student in our community that passed away. And that student, moments before his death, was on the phone with a therapist and police officers, and what he was saying was he was battling this deep depression and suicidal thoughts, and he didn't want to live anymore because he didn't have anyone to talk to. And I hope and pray that family in our community knows that there's a place that's praying for him and a place that's for him. But I don't bring that up to just harbor on that situation. I bring it up because the truth is that many of us probably struggle with the same things. Where we walk through the door, we put on a smile, we tell everybody around us everything is fine, and yet we may be carrying things like our stresses or our anxiety, or our shame, or our guilt, or sin that we don't want anybody else to see because we want to hide it and act like we're perfect and we have nothing to hide, or our hurt, or we try to hide our loss, or we're carrying our grief, or we're carrying our pain, or we're carrying our mental health. There are things that we walk into this room with a mask that we wear, and all we try to do is hide. Mental health is a great example of this. I wrote down some statistics that I found this week, and some of them were shocking, but if you're in this space, you would know that they're not. 34% of young adults aged 18 to 25 have some form of diagnosed mental illness. 34%. That is 1 in 3 young adults in college and early marriage, 18 to 25, that are carrying the weight of a diagnosed mental illness. If you look around and you say, well, that doesn't apply to me. Well, 28% of adults aged 26 through 49 have a diagnosed mental illness. 28. That is 1 in 4 adults that are in this room in some capacity have a diagnosed mental illness. 50-year-olds, if you're 50 and up, it's 15%. But the interesting thing about these statistics is that those statistics are the reported diagnosed mental illness. If we look deeper than that, we would know that there are many people in our community, in our life, and in our country that are too afraid to actually say what's going on, and they walk around every day with an undiagnosed mental illness, with something that they're struggling with. If you're a man in the room, you know what this is like, because you don't want anybody to know that you have any problems. You don't want anybody to know that you have anything going on. And what happens is we do everything we can, all of us, to hide what's really going on, to hide how we're really feeling, to ultimately to hide what we're struggling with. And when you dive into teenagers, the statistics get even crazier, because the CDC every year does a study that tracks high schoolers. And it's a study of thousands and thousands of students across the United States, and it studies mental health, and these statistics are staggering. But the first one is that in 2023, they haven't done 2024 yet, 40% of high schoolers experience persistent feelings of sadness or hopelessness. That is not just the occasional, hey, my grandmother passed away and I'm sad. No. These were students who willingly went on record to admit that they had dealt with persistent and consistent feelings of hopelessness and of sadness. 20% of high schoolers, 1 in 5 high schoolers, seriously contemplated suicide. 1 in every high schooler in America has contemplated suicide. 16% had even made a plan. And for those of you that say, well, that doesn't happen around here, that doesn't happen in our state, it doesn't happen in our Bible Belt, in 2022, there were over 1,500 teenager suicides in the state of Georgia alone. 1,500. We had 2 in our local community, 7th grade boys from North Gwinnett Middle and Lanier Middle last school year. And I don't tell you any of these statistics because my whole sermon is going to be about mental health. I tell you these statistics because this is happening all around us, to our students, to our community. And if we're honest for a moment, to many of us in the room, the truth is that regardless of what we're wrestling with, there are things inside us that we are often too scared to bring to light. There are things that we've dealt with that we're too afraid to tell anybody about. There are stresses and anxieties. There's depression. There's thoughts. There are things. There is sin that we've done our hardest and done our whatever best to try and hide from everyone around us, because if they only knew what I was about, if they only knew what I did. There are so many things in our life that we are too afraid to bring to light. There are demons that we are fighting that we often want to keep inside, and we become afraid that if only they knew. If only they knew this about me, if only they knew what I had dealt with, if only they knew what was going on in my life. The countless number of times that I've heard that for our students. 7 years in student ministry, I hear that over and over and over again. A student that's too afraid and said, if only they knew. And many of us carry around what we label as problems, and we have nowhere to share them, and we're afraid. We're afraid that if we were to actually open up, people would tell other people about it. We're afraid that if we were to actually open up, people would judge us for our past and what we're feeling. We're afraid that if we were to actually open up, this is one for men, we'd be labeled as weak. We would be labeled as emotional. We would be labeled that we don't have our stuff together, or I don't know how to lead a family, or I don't know how to lead my wife. Like, we would be labeled as these things. If only people knew. I'm too afraid, because if they did, we'd be labeled with those things. I'd be labeled as a problem. But the one that I hear more than anything else from our students and from people in our community is, if I were to actually open up, I'm afraid that I would feel like a burden. I'm afraid that I would feel like a burden, but the truth is we all feel like a burden. We've got stuff in our closet. We've got chains that we carry. There's stuff that we walk into this room and we put on a mask and we say, I'm fine, and we smile and say nothing's going on. But if we were honest with ourselves, our deepest fear is that we are going to be a burden to those around us. I don't want to share in small group, because if I did and they knew that about me, I don't want to share that with this group. I don't want to share that in church. I don't want to tell anybody I'm really struggling, because if they did, I don't want my problems to become your problems. It's the same thing that we say over and over and over again. But the truth is, if we all admit it, we all have felt like we would be a burden. And this morning, what I want to do is I want to dig into this. I want to dig into this idea of being ourselves and being authentic, leaving our mask at the door and finding community that we can count on and be our authentic self in. This morning, I want to look at a passage from 2 Corinthians, and I always love to talk about these letters of the New Testament. 2 Corinthians is a letter. It's not a book. It's not a history lesson. It is a letter. There's a guy named Paul that we talk about in church a whole lot. And what's cool about Paul's story is that Paul used to be a guy named Saul. And Paul was not always the OG Christian. He was not always the super Christian. In fact, he hated Christians. He despised Christians. He even killed Christians. He did everything in his power to stop the Christian movement, and Saul had an encounter with Jesus, the risen Jesus, after he had come back to life, and he goes, oh, gosh, yeah, you're the guy that everyone said you were, like, you know what I mean? Like, you're real. And so Saul decides he's going to turn his life around, and instead of persecuting Christians and killing Christians and stopping the movement, he became one of the founding fathers of the Christian movement, and he went all around the Mediterranean Sea and started church after church after church. And throughout his life, he wrote these letters to different churches that he had heard about, different churches that he had visited, and different churches that he had helped start. And so Paul, I love to talk about Paul because it's a guy who did everything in his power to do one thing and then all of a sudden did a 180. And if you know anybody in your life that's done that, you know it takes a lot. It takes a lot for somebody to admit that they're wrong. It takes a lot for somebody to admit that they made a mistake. And so Paul writes these letters to these groups of churches, and one to Corinth is 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and it's one that he had visited, it's one that he was known to be a part of, and so he wrote this letter to 2nd Corinthians, and I want to dig into it because what it talks about is how in the world do we be our true and authentic self? How do we leave the mask at the door and carry our chains, the things we want to keep in the closet with us? So Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, I'm going to read verses 7 through 10, but he kicks off with this. He says, "Therefore, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, I was given a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan to torment me." It's funny, that kind of sounds a little conceited. But Paul says, in order to keep me from becoming conceited, to keep me from becoming the cocky king, to keep me from being like that, it's like I have this thorn inside of me. And in this passage prior to, Paul describes this thorn, and many scholars try to figure out what it is, but most people believe that this thorn that Paul is talking about is a mental illness. It's a condition that he's dealt with, that he's wrestled with, that he's tried to hide away, that he's tried not to talk about, that he's tried to let nobody in and see. And what Paul is saying in this moment is he's saying, I was given this thorn, this thing that keeps bugging me, sent from Satan. But he goes on in verse 8 and he says this. It says, 3 times I have pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. He's like, look, I've prayed. I've tried to pray. I've tried to ask for it to go away. I've done it over and over again. And yet, this is what Jesus tells me. My grace is sufficient for you. And my power is made stronger in your weakness. And this thorn that you call sent from Satan. He goes on and says, therefore, I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses and in insults and hardships and persecutions and difficulties. For when I am weak, I am strong. Paul is writing, he says, hey, I have these things in my closet. I have this stuff I don't want anybody to see. I have these weaknesses. But instead of trying to continue to hide them, instead of continuing to try to act like they don't exist, instead of continuing to put on a mask and smile and say everything's fine, he's saying, no. Jesus wants us to delight in our weaknesses. He wants us to boast, to brag in our weaknesses. In some ways, it's like he's celebrating this thorn that he literally says is sent from Satan. And he's saying he delights in his weaknesses. Here's the reason that he's saying that. Paul is saying he delights in his weaknesses because he knows something. Paul knows that Christ shows out in his weaknesses. He knows that when he is weak, God can do something in the midst of his weakness to make him seem a whole lot stronger. Paul knows that Christ shows out in his weaknesses. And this is like the OG Christian we're talking about, right? This is the guy who founded these churches, that wrote these letters, and he's admitting to the Corinthians, this church in Corinth, this is the weakness that I've dealt with. This is the thorn that's in my flesh. But you know what? I'm not going to hide it. I'm not going to keep it hidden. I'm not going to keep it in my closet. I'm going to celebrate and delight in my weaknesses because I know that that's where Christ can be made stronger. He's saying he delights in it because he knows that's where Christ can be the most evident. Everyone loves a good underdog story, right? Everyone loves to see a 16 seed almost be the first seed. Everyone loves to see the small team, the short team, the unathletic team beat the team everyone thought was going to win. Like, everybody loves an underdog story. Why do we love an underdog story? Because we're celebrating their win over their weaknesses. We're celebrating that they won despite being weak. We're celebrating that they won despite being smaller and shorter and not having as much money and not having a 5-star course, whatever it is, right? Like, we're celebrating because they won over their weaknesses. And what Paul is saying is this. He's saying, because I am weak, because I am vulnerable, it makes Christ that much more evident in my life. He's saying, because I'm broken, because I have things that I didn't want anybody to see, because I have stuff that I wrestle with and continue to wrestle with, it makes Christ that much more evident in my life. Because I'm weak, because I'm vulnerable, it makes Christ that much more evident. But the question I want to answer this morning is, why in the world should that matter to you? Why should that matter to me? Why should that matter to any of us? I've got three things that I believe that if Paul were here and he was writing to Sugar Hill Church, the three things that I think he would want us to know from this passage, three things that we ought to do because of this truth. The first one is this: acknowledge our weaknesses. Acknowledge our weakness. Some of us in our life, this is really easy. We know what we wrestle with. We know what we struggle with. But for many of us, we may not. We may need to acknowledge our anxieties, or we may need to acknowledge our fear, or our stresses, or our depression, or our addiction. We may need to acknowledge the sin that we've wrestled with, the one that we've tried to keep hidden from everyone else in our life, the one that we've hidden from our spouses, the one that we've hidden from our friends, the one that we've hidden for our entire life. There's something inside of us. Sometimes we just need to acknowledge our weakness. The immorality, the guilt, the shame, the regret, the thing that we've been holding on to that we didn't want anybody else to see. The first thing that many of us need to do is acknowledge our weaknesses. Acknowledging the weakness when you say, well, I can quit when I want. I can stop whenever I want if I wanted to. I don't really do that anymore. It's acknowledging that you fall short and that you look like just everybody else. It's acknowledging our weaknesses. The second thing that I think Paul would tell us this morning is we've got to bring it to light. We've got to bring it to light. And this is a hard one. This is not one that we wake up every day and it's like, I want to tell everyone about my business. But we can't keep our weaknesses in the dark. We can't walk this road alone. That's what Bobby's entire sermon was last week, which was the community helps guide us and helps lead us, and we've got to walk this road with community. We cannot walk this road alone. We've got to bring these things to light. We can't keep wearing the mask that we put on each day and act like everything's okay. We've got to bring it to light. We've got to let people in, because it was never meant to be walked alone. The truth about sin is that sin grows in the dark. It doesn't grow in the light. The sin in our life, the things that we want to keep hidden, it doesn't grow in the light. It grows in the dark. And you and I both know, if you've had any life experience, you know this, that one day that sin comes to light. No matter how hard you try, no matter how deep you've pushed it, no matter what you've done to try to not tell anybody, eventually that sin comes to light. And if we allow it to continue to grow, it's going to grow out of control. We've got to bring it to light. If we want a full and a free life, we've got to bring it to light. But here's the thing. As Jesus told Paul in this passage, the important thing to know is that Jesus is looking at each and every one of us and he's saying, my grace is sufficient for you. Whatever you've got growing on in the dark, no matter what you have in your closet that you don't want anybody to see, he's saying, my grace is sufficient for you. He's reminding Paul and he's reminding each of us that it doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter how far you feel. Like, that's the good news of the gospel, right? It doesn't matter what you've done. It doesn't matter how far you feel. Jesus is saying, come and see, my grace is sufficient for you. No matter what you have in your closet, no matter what you've wrestled with, no matter what you've walked through, my grace is sufficient for you. You are never too bad. You are never too far away. You've never done too much wrong. Come and see. That's what Jesus is telling each and every single one of us, but we've got to bring it to light. We've got to bring our weaknesses. Some of us in the room, that's where we need to start, is acknowledging our weaknesses. Many of us in the room need to move towards bringing those weaknesses to light and not holding those in the dark in our closet. But the third one is sometimes the hardest. It's the one we have to get to, which is we have to boast in it. We have to boast in it. If we acknowledge our weaknesses, if we bring it to light, we've got to celebrate our weaknesses in order to see how God can and did work in every single one of them. Paul is telling us we've got to boast in it. Because he's saying we've got to celebrate how God moves in our weaknesses. We've got to celebrate the underdog story. When we see God move, we ought to celebrate it as Paul did. We boast in it because it's evidence God is working. As again, each of us are walking in this path of life, and we've got to figure out which of the three we're on. We've got to acknowledge our weakness for some of us. For some of us, we've got to bring it to light. But I bet you there's a bunch of us in this room that have walked through that path and done those first two things, but we've yet to actually boast in it. We've yet to actually allow our story to be a story that helps and leads and guides those around us. I bet you there's people in this room that have walked through divorce, that have walked through addiction, that have walked through drugs and alcohol. There are people in this room that have walked through things in their life, and they've done the steps of bringing it to light, of having a counselor, of getting help. But are they celebrating their win over their weaknesses? I bet you there's people in this room that could help somebody else walk through what they walked through. Help somebody else feel the calm of the storm that they are in. I bet you there are people in this room that have yet to boast in it. That's the story of Stephanie. Stephanie's video this morning, it wasn't planned at all. Nobody knew what I was going to preach on because, again, I'm the punter, but the crazy thing about her story and about that video is that it's exactly this. That she was willing not only to walk through the storm, not only to bring it to light in a group of people, but now here she is on the other side of it, and she's boasting in it. She's telling others the way that God moved in her weakness, how he showed up in her storm and made a difference. And I'm not downplaying professional help. I'm not downplaying the necessity for a therapist, but I imagine there are people in this room that could help others walk through the seasons that they've walked through. So wherever we are, we've got to acknowledge our weakness. We've got to admit that we fall short. There are things that we've never wanted anybody else to see. We've got to bring them to light, know that we're not walking this road alone, and ultimately we have to boast in it because that is where God moves the most. When we celebrate and delight in our weakness. I want you to imagine just for a few moments what that could mean for your life. For those of you that walked in this room and you feel like the Spirit just punched you in the face, whatever it is, I want you to imagine a world where your small group was a safe space, where your community was a safe space, where this church was a place where you didn't have to wear your mask and smile and say everything is fine, but yet you could leave it at the door. You could acknowledge your weakness. You could bring it to light. That this would be a place where you could walk with other believers to become wise in community. That this is a place that you could commit to one another. That this is a place where you've chosen not to continue to hide the things that you don't want anybody else to see. But you've been committed to bring your weaknesses to light and to celebrate the ways that God has moved in and through every single one of us. That's the world that I want each of us to live in. And so in just a moment, what we're going to do is we're going to put 2 QR codes on the side screens, and one of those QR codes is a link to our prayer list. If you've ever didn't know, we have a team of people, both staff and also a small group that prays over every single one of these prayer requests. And we don't go out and share them and broadcast them to the internet or anything, but we do it because there are a team of people that every time you submit that prayer, there are a group of people that actively are praying to you. I get an email each week from one of the members on our staff team that shares those prayers with me, and I read that list and I pray over those names. And so for you, if you're one of those people that you're like, man, I just am walking through this, I want to bring this to light, and I just want a team of people praying for me, that's a way to do it. The other QR code is a link to what we call Clear Path Counseling. It's one of our partners that are certified counselors and certified therapists. I, again, am not one of those people, and so I'm not going to act like you don't need that, because there are many of us, and I would argue all of us in some way in our lifetime, that need actual counseling. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to feel guilty about. But if you're one of those people that are like, man, I really would love a next step to get some help with the junk that I'm walking through, the storm that I need help in, Clear Path Counseling is a great way and a great step to make. The last thing that we're going to do this morning is we're going to sing a song together, and I'm going to invite you in just a moment to stand and sing. But during that moment, if you're one of those people that were like, hey, I really just need prayer. I don't want to just submit the prayer request. I'll do that later. Like, I need prayer right now. I've walked into the room with something that I want to get off my chest. I've walked into the room wearing the mask for my entire life. I've walked in the room and I just need prayer. We're going to have a team of people up here. Some of our staff team, if you're one of those people that are on our prayer team, I would invite you to be up here. If you're one of those people that is just like a go-getter and a prayer, I would invite you to come up here. And this front of this stage will be open. If you don't want to share it with anybody, you don't want to talk to anybody, you just want to talk to God, I would invite you to do that, whether it's here, whether it's at your seat, or whether it's anywhere in the room. There's going to be a team of people praying up here with you. So at this time, I would invite you just to stand. I would invite you to sing if you want to sing, pray if you want to pray, and get prayed over if you want to get prayed over. But my hope is that you remember that we don't have to hide our weaknesses in a closet. We get to bring them to light because we get to celebrate what God can and does do through each and every one of our stories. Don't walk the road alone. Be your authentic and true self. Let's sing together.
Price for my heart, and I don't have a contest, that kind of love I don't understand, I can't comprehend. All I know is I need you. I run to the Father, fall into grace, done with incredible day of encountering our Heavenly Father. Thank you, Pastor Jordan, for the word that you brought today. Yes. We're going to be here. Some of our team is still going to be here. We're going to linger in the moment. If you need prayer, feel free to come forward. But we just want to send you with this reminder that your Heavenly Father walks with you through the journey of this life. And may He go before you this week and make a way. We'll see you soon. Have a great rest of your week.